Hey guys, this is Kelly with St. Johns County Parks and Recreation, and today I'm going to give you a talk that I would normally give in our libraries, but because we can't be in person at the library, I want to bring this talk to you today in your home. Maybe you're in your pajamas, maybe you're sitting out back in the porch enjoying the sunshine. It doesn't matter, but we're going to focus today on invasive species. And before we get started, I want to give you guys a little bit of background of who I am, what I do, where I work. I work for St. Johns County, which for those of you who don't live locally is in the St. Augustine area of Northeast Florida. And we have a super diverse county here. So we have everything from the Atlantic Ocean to the intercoastal over to the St. Johns River. And this provides us with a wide variety of ecosystems where all sorts of different plants can live. Most of them are good, but some of the ones we're going to talk about today are bad, and they're not from here, and they're causing havoc on our natural ecosystems. So we have things that really like our dune systems. There are several plants that I'll talk about today that you will predominantly only find in our dunes by the beach. And then I have other plants you'll only predominantly find along the St. Johns River where it's wetter, more fresh water, higher and drier. So we'll go over all of that, but specifically I work for our Parks and Recreation department. And our Parks and Rec department is a really diverse department. We have a lot of recreational opportunities within our department. So we have everything from softball fields to tennis courts to beach access points to boat ramps to some community playgrounds and community centers to trails. And so my job within the department is specifically focused on most outdoor nature-based recreation. So I specifically am the St. Johns County Parks Naturalist. I think I have the best job. I absolutely love what I do. Even under these times, I'm super happy to be able to bring educational material to you and share my passion for our Florida ecosystems, even though we can't be in person. But when this pandemic is over and we can be in person again, come on a beach walk with me, come kayaking with me, come see this talk live at the library. I give other talks on things like snakes and gators, so that's what you see here in this picture to the right. I also help to maintain our natural areas. So I do invasive species surveys, I do wildlife surveys, I help write management plans. So I have a really diverse job that keeps me out of the office and outside enjoying our Florida ecosystems and sharing my joy for our Florida ecosystems with our residents and visitors of St. Johns County. So today's presentation is going to be on invasive species. And normally at this point in the presentation, I would ask you all to respond to my question, and I know you can't, but just think about the answers and humor me and respond on your own. But what in the world is an invasive species? And usually I'm sitting in a room with a whole bunch of people and I would ask, raise your hand if you're from Florida. Usually like 5 people raise their hand. And then I would say, raise your hand if you're not from Florida and you're a transplant. My hand goes shooting up because I'm from New York. So I raise my hand, other people in the room raise their hand, and almost 99.9% of the time, the people who are not from Florida dominate the room. So we're invasive, we're not from here, and we're non-native because we're not from here, and we're invasive because we're just taking over. And that's a really good visual of what these plants are doing. Now, we're welcomed invasions. There's a lot of people who move to Florida, including myself, because it's beautiful and awesome sunshine, but these plants are not welcome. These plants are wreaking havoc on our ecosystems. So at a basic level, a scientific definition of an invasive species is a plant or animal, we're going to focus on plants today, that comes from another place and becomes a problem in its new location that impacts human health, the economy, and or the environment. And I'm going to talk today about the environment aspect of things. And usually when these plants come in, they upset the balance of our ecosystem and they outcompete our natives. And sometimes they form what is called a monoculture, meaning they're the only plant that you're going to see there. And that's never good in any ecosystem. So there is a little caveat here. You'll see a plant or animal that usually comes from another place. The ones we're going to talk about today solely come from another place. Every now and again, you get what we call a native behaving badly. Those are native plants in disturbed situations, so not in a normal balanced ecosystem, but in an area where we've disturbed the ecosystem, that they take over and they explode. Not as common, but it does happen, so I wanted to mention it. And like I said, from here on out, we're going to focus on plants that are non-native, meaning not from Florida, but that are also invasive, meaning they are taking over and causing negative impacts on our Florida ecosystems. I do want to preface that not every non-native plant, so not everything that's not from Florida is harmful. There are plenty of Florida-friendly plants that are not from Florida that you can plant in one place and they won't quote unquote escape. That's actually a scientific term for what's happened to some of these plants. We've put them in one area and they've escaped. We think about that a lot more when it comes to animals, but that's also the term that can be used when referring to plants. So just how big of a problem does Florida have on their hands for invasive species? Well, about 1.7 million, that's actually a low number, acres of Florida's natural areas are considered infested with an invasive species. 42% of federally endangered species have become declined as a result of invasive species. An estimated cost of $500 million a year are utilized to treat invasive plants. And I think, once again, this is a low number. This is a really low estimate because you have multiple levels of government treating invasive species on top of the private sector. So you have the federal government with the Army Corps of Engineers doing invasive species work. You have state government with the state park system and FWC and water management district all have their own invasive plants. And then you have a whole bunch of municipalities, towns, cities, counties that all also do invasive work. So this problem is really big, and there's a lot of money put into treating these plants in our natural areas, but also in agricultural systems and also in waterways. So we're not going to talk about anything that grows in the water today. There's a whole different lecture on aquatic invasive plants, but we're going to talk about things that live on land today. And Florida is ranked number 2 in the United States for invasive species. So we're behind Hawaii in the number and the quantity of invasive plants that we have here. And that's predominantly because of our warm, amazing ecosystem. So we are a subtropical, tropical state where a lot of things like to grow that couldn't handle the harsh winters further north. So we get a lot of things that thrive here that don't thrive in other places of the United States. So how did we get this problem? Well, it's a combination of things. First and foremost, Florida is a point of entry for almost 3/4 of the plants that are imported into the United States. So we have a lot of plants coming from other places that are coming through our port system, and with that comes their seeds and those individual plants themselves. We have a huge plant nursery here in the state of Florida, which makes sense because, like I said before, things like to grow here. And sometimes we grow things that are harmful to our environment, or we grew them in the past and they've escaped and we're no longer growing them, but we're still dealing with the effects of growing them. We intentionally introduce them. So there will be plants I talk about today that you can go to the store and buy and put in your yard because some of them are regulated and some of them are not. And it just goes back to our environment. We have a great environment here where things really love to thrive. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the legislation surrounding these plants, because I get the question a lot of, well, Kelly, you're telling me these plants are really harmful to the environment, but I can go to the store and buy them. So I want you to somewhat understand what that process is to regulate these plants and which regulations have teeth and what are more guidelines. So the thing that has teeth are noxious weed listings. And we have 2 sets of noxious weed listings. We have the federal set of noxious weed listings and the state set of noxious weed listings. And both of them do not permit the sale, the transport, or the growing, like intentional growing for sale, of anything that's listed on that noxious weed list. So on the federal listing, there are over 100 species, and they include things like hydrilla and Kogan grass and melaleuca. These are the worst of the worst. These are the ones that have caused problems, usually in more than one state, multiple states. And typically, these are things that have impacted agriculture and waterways. Then we have a state noxious weed list, which means it's only restricted for the state of Florida, and you cannot possess or sell the plant and that includes 75 species, and this includes things like Australian pine, air potato, and Chinese tallow. Now, just because they're on a noxious weed list doesn't mean that if you have one growing in your backyard, you're going to get in trouble. It just means you couldn't try to put it in a pot and sell it to somebody else. That would be illegal. So you can't try to transport it anywhere or any of that stuff. Now, it is strongly encouraged that you remove it on your private property, but there's really no mandate to go ahead and remove it. So this next set of lists that I'm going to talk about, the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. And as a land manager, this is a list that we utilize to help guide management decisions. So there are two categories on this Flexi list. That's what I'm going to call it from here on out. And category 1, meaning these plants are causing huge harm to our natural communities and are actually altering the function or the makeup of that community. And things on that list are things like coral Artesia, Asparagus Fern, and Mexican Petunia. Then category 2 species means we're starting to see them a lot. They're popping up in multiple counties. They're popping up in great frequency. The area in which they're taking up is starting to grow. So we're watching these. We don't want them to become a category 1, but it's not a huge widespread problem across the state. And it's not quite reaching that point where it's altering native plant communities. So those are on the list of, if we have them, let's get rid of them now before they get to a category 1. And we as land managers utilize these lists, like I said, to make management decisions. The Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council also goes to legislators to try to get these plants on the noxious weed list if they're not already. Now, the FLEPC listing as category 1 or category 2 are simply guidelines. They have no teeth. So when I mention things throughout the rest of this presentation that are category 1 or category 2, but are not a noxious weed, there's no real regulations banning people from selling them at any of your local nurseries or stores in the area. Like I said, these are just guidelines. These are things that we as land managers have scientific data behind to show they're causing negative harm to our natural areas. So I'm going to go through about 10 plants that you could have right in your backyard right now, kind of put it on your radar of what they look like, why they're bad. I'm going to touch on some removal methods, but when we're all done, I'll show you where to find resources to get data on how best to remove some of these plants. I'm also going to provide you with what plants you could replace these with, because we have beautiful, beautiful Florida native plants that you can get that will replace these plants in your landscaping. So the first, and I know there's a lot of you who love bees and butterflies and pollinators, your heart may break a little at this one, but Lantana. Yeah, so Lantana is a category 1 species. When it gets into our native areas, it can cause huge patches of nothing growing but Lantana. This is actually native to the West Indies and was traded worldwide as an ornamental starting in the 1800s. This is the most studied weed in the world. In fact, it's found in 47 countries. And if you do have dogs or cats that like to eat plants, you definitely want to remove this from your landscaping because this can be highly toxic to any animals that ingest it. There are over 650 different types, different cultivars of Lantana, and only 3 of those are actually from Florida. So a lot of times when we go to nurseries or places, we just think, oh, it must be the native Lantana. Well, that's really hard to tell just from looking at a plant in a nursery. So the study suggests that we steer clear of Lantana because odds are you're going to get one of those other 647 cultivars and not one of the natives. Now, if you have Lantana in your landscape currently, just keep an eye on it and make sure it's not quote unquote escaping. Like I said, you can get this in your big box stores or in your local nurseries. You can see on my slide here that little store symbol next to the name. So as we go on, anything that has that little store icon next to the name is something you can go out and get in the store, and that I'm telling you it's a category 1 species or category 2 species, and it's not recommended to put in your yard. Now, The top picture here with the red lantana is called red bloomfly rose, and that lantana seems to be a sterile species of lantana. So if you are going to put lantana in your yard and you can't confirm whether or not something is actually one of the native strains, you can put that in your yard because it's not supposed to produce seeds that are viable. Now, if you have lantana in your yard and you want to go ahead and remove it, there are lots and lots of other native plants that you can put in your yard that will give you pops of color and attract all sorts of pollinators. You have Walter's Viburnum, which clusters and white flowers, which has a similar look to the lantana clustered flowers. If you're looking for those reds and those oranges, blanket flower is beautiful. I have this in landscaping in my office. And then horse mint is another great plant to use for those pollinators. The next plant I'm going to talk to you probably have in your landscaping, and if you don't, your neighbor probably does. This plant we see everywhere in landscaping. This is a Category 1 species that is native to Mexico and Western South America. This was introduced in the 1930s, and it spreads super quickly as ground cover. So any of you who have this in your landscaping know that you constantly have to be pushing it back because it's always going right to the edge, right to your sidewalks, right to your yard. And once it gets into our natural areas, it does that, but there's no curb, there's no driveway, there's no sidewalk to stop it. So it just keeps going. So that's what that picture is on the bottom of a natural area that's been completely infested with Mexican Petunia. It spreads super quick and it's prolific seeder. So it's constantly dropping seeds that are then forming new plants. So if you do have Mexican Petunia in your yard, I can tell you, you can hand pull it. The roots are not all that deep. Just to know, as with almost any of these plants, it's not a one-time and done. These plants are invasive species for a reason, which means they can be very hard to get rid of. So if you are going to hand pull them and remove them, know you will be hand pulling for a while because they will continue to pop up for several months after that first initial hand pull. If you would like to replace Mexican Petunia with other purpley flowered plants that will do well in your landscaping, we do have a native wild Petunia to Florida. That one will be a little bit harder to find in your stores, but the next two will be fairly easy to find at any of your local nurseries. We have the purple coneflower, and then we have blue porterweed, which if you're looking for something to fill an area that also has the potential to kind of continue to push the boundaries of that landscaping, blue porterweed's a great plant to have that will continue to grow in a similar fashion that Mexican Petunia does. The next plant is my Archnemesis. I have spent a lot of hours, as well as some really dedicated volunteers, pulling this plant. I've also been working for the last 2.5 years with the University of Florida to come up with a removal method aside from hand pulling. So what they have found in their research so far is that this plant is great at surviving. When they actually took plants here, they pulled a bunch to pull in their greenhouse to do some experiments on. Of the 400 plants that they took, then put in a bag, drove all the way back to Gainesville, then repotted in a Gainesville greenhouse, only one died in that process of being uprooted and replanted, which is amazing. So these guys are a Category 2 species that you can go and get at the store today. They are originally native to Madagascar, and these guys thrive in areas around our dune system. They like the dry, arid environments. They're similar to a succulent. They have that succulent feel on their leaves, and they can be green and purpley, and they have these beautiful red flowers, also known as a chandelier plant, because it looks like a chandelier with all of those red flowers pointed down. And they bloom in January, February. You'll see them if you go to the beach. The whole dune or sections of the dunes will all be red with this flower. And what is very, very tricky about these guys is that they reproduce through plantlets. So if you look at this top picture here, you can see that this plant has a bunch of baby plants on it. So it grows little bitty baby plants on every single one of its leaves. Those baby plants then drop and become big adult plants. So that's why this plant also gets the name Mother of Millions. Now this plant also has super shallow root system. The longest roots I've ever seen on them are maybe this long. And that is not something we want in our dune system. So our dunes, which are prone to being hit by hurricanes and nor'easters, normally would have native plants in them like sea oats that have long, extensive, huge root systems that are going to hold that sand in place. Well, with roots this big, you're not holding much in place. So we definitely don't want these plants on our dune system. And so the county has started removal efforts in some of our areas of the dunes. And like I said, we're also working with UF and are in contact with them in their lab to see what the latest and greatest innovation is to remove plants like this. Because we also know that it's very hard and it takes a very regimented schedule of hand pulling, because once you hand pull, you still have lots of little baby plants left behind. So it's a constant process for hand pulling, and we just have some patches that are too large to effectively hand pull. So we'll see what that research turns up. They've had some promising initial findings, and we'll see where they go from here. It's exciting to be working on the cutting edge of research for the environmental community, so stay tuned for that. Now, if you do have Kalanchoe or mother of millions, things that you can replace it with that will grow fast and require almost no maintenance are the following. Now, these are not necessarily plants that look the same or have the same function, but anything in the agave family, you can pretty much just plop in that super sandy soil by the beach and let it grow. You don't have to worry about it. The beach sunflower will spread like Kalanchoe does. It's a great ground cover. It likes to be in full sun. And then you have the prickly pear cactus, which is one of my favorites. The prickly pear, although may seem spiky and somewhat intimidating to have in your landscape, once you put it in the ground, that initial water to get it going, you won't have to touch it again. And it gets very similar coloration fruit on it as the flowering Kalanchoe does. It's also a great food resource for the gopher tortoise. They love prickly pear cactus fruits. The next plant you'll also find in our coastal areas, this is Asparagus Fern. This is a Category 2 species that is native to South Africa. It is a ground cover, and it also is in container gardens. So you'll see this a lot in like hanging plants or in potted plants. And when they grow, they turn into this big fluffy bush, like the bottom picture here. And then they also get these pretty red berries. Now, because of these pretty red berries, the wildlife love to eat asparagus fern, but that also means they're transporting those seeds to other areas and sending them out the other end fertilized. So we don't want asparagus fern in our landscapes. It establishes really quickly and it chokes out our native vegetation, especially in our dune systems. We've been working hard with several removal projects to remove asparagus fern in about 30 or so acres of county dunes. So that's been a great project. Now you can also, if you only have one or two in your landscape, dig this one up. But be aware that at the bottom of this plant is like a yam. There's like this potato yam at the bottom, and you have to get that yam. So if you just cut everything that's on top of the soil and let it go, it will grow right back. You have to get a shovel and get that yam underneath, especially if you only have one or two. That's a very effective removal method. So some alternatives to asparagus fern, if you're looking for things that will stay round and somewhat fluffy looking, these three are great alternatives. You have Stokes aster, which gets beautiful purple flowers, which is a great added benefit. You have Coontie fern. Just know that whatever size Coontie fern you go and get at the store, it will likely stay that size for a while. These are a very slow growing species of plant. And then you have this dwarf yaupon holly that typically is trimmed into those circles that you see in a lot of your parking lot landscapes. The dwarf yaupon holly does get some red berries on it, and the Coontie fern does get almost like a corn-like seed pod that has bright orange seeds in it. Silverthorne. So I see this a lot in our coastal environments as a shrub, a maintained manicured shrub. It is a Category 2 species. It is native to China and Japan. It was originally introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental. So if you haven't been paying attention so far, note that almost everything we've talked about so far has come over purposely by humans to be planted in our landscapes. We like to take pretty plants and put them in new places, not knowing fully what the consequences are when we did that originally. This can also occur in a climbing form, So like I said, we often see it as manicured hedges in our coastal areas, but in our natural areas, what I tend to see in our dunes and some of our maritime hammock forests and on the edges of our marsh, we have this as more of a climbing vine, which makes sense because if you have this plant or you're familiar with this plant, when it starts to get out of control, it almost looks like it put its finger in a light socket. It gets all of these kind of crazy ends coming up, like the bottom picture here. And those crazy ends then in a natural environment start to climb up trees and things. This thing is shade tolerant, drought tolerant, salt tolerant. And so, like I said, it can handle those coastal ecosystems. So if you have this and you're utilizing it as a hedge, some other great plants that will act in a similar manner are sea grape. They're beautiful. They're native to really just south of the St. Augustine area, but they will grow here if you can get them through that first winter without freezes. Know that any subsequent freezes, the tops will die back. You'll have to cut the dead stuff off, and then there will be new regrowth. But those guys are really cool. We also have Simpson stoppers, which can be manicured just like a hedge, just like the silverthorne, except they have a great added bonus of these red berries that the wildlife love. They are super nutritious for the wildlife. The Simpson stopper is really cool. I have one at my office. And then wax myrtle as well. Now know that wax myrtle is going to grow into a small to medium sized tree, but it will have that same kind of structure that a silverthorne would have if you're looking for that. Just be careful with trimming this one. You don't want to hack it into a shrub. Camphor tree. So camphor trees are a category 1 species. So these are, remember that list of plants that has a negative impact on our natural ecosystems. They are native to Eastern Asia. They were introduced in 1875. And unlike the other ones where they've been introduced purposely because we thought they were pretty and would look nice in a landscape, these actually came in to establish a commercial oil and timber business, which didn't quite work out. And the seeds are spread by animals. And it's super identifiable by the smell. So if you know what camphor smells like, similar to kind of like bug repellent. So if you take those leaves and crush it, you'll get a very distinctive smell right away. This is a very large tree that in order to remove, you do have to cut down and spray with specific chemicals, because as with most of these trees that we will talk about, if you just cut them down, they will regrow, which means you have a smaller version of the large tree, but you haven't really gotten rid of the problem. Some things to remove camphors with. You have a whole lot of options for native trees. These are just 3 that I came up with. You have red maples, which are beautiful. You have live oaks, also gorgeous. And then you have red bay trees, which I am partial to. They also smell great. So if you cook with bay leaves, it is a relative of the Mediterranean bay leaves that you use in cooking, except it's native to Florida, but it has a very similar bay smell to it. Oral Artesia. So for those of you who live more inland, closer to the St. Johns River, this one is a real problem. This is also known as the Christmas berry, and this is on the Florida noxious weed list. So you cannot go and buy this at the store. This is a category 1 species that is originally native to Japan, and it was brought to the US as an ornamental. It's a small shrub. You can see this guy standing in the picture. That's about the height it grows to. It doesn't grow into a huge tree. But the problem is you can see all of these little berries all over the ground here on all of these plants. Those berries have a germination rate anywhere from 84 to 98%. So they're incredibly effective at continually to seed in an area, and that's why you have huge patches of these in our natural areas. Our county parks and rec department has identified a couple of properties that have a coral artesia problem, and we actually got funding to go ahead and remove them with a partnership through FWC. So we're slowly but surely getting there. If you walk our county parks and you see these invasives, know that I am on it. Our department is working on trying to make our parks invasive free. It's going to be a long road, but we're well on our way. So some Some alternatives to coral artesia that still give you that beautiful red coloration, which is what a lot of people are looking for when they want to keep coral artesia in their yards. You have their yaupon hollies. We have lots of native hollies, so it doesn't necessarily even have to be the yaupon holly. That's more of a tree. We come back to our Simpson stoppers. Once again, you can make this into some sort of hedge. You get those beautiful red berries. My favorite, which is really pretty, is red salvia. So we do have native salvias here in Florida, and they get these tall red flowers on them, and the pollinators love them. So I'm partial to red salvia if you're going to go ahead and replace that coral artesia. Chinese tallow, also on the noxious weed list, also illegal to sell, so you can't go to the store and get this, or you shouldn't be able to go to the store and get this. Let me put it that way. There are consequences for whatever store would be selling it. This is native to China. It was imported in the 1700s and then again in the 1900s as a potential seed oil crop. That also didn't work out very well. This grows really well in wet and dry soil. So once again, this is going to be a more inland plant that you're going to see further away from the beach. And these guys send out runners. So you have the main tree, and then they'll send out runners or roots that will start to form other trees. So you'll oftentimes have the mother tree in the middle that's usually quite large, and then lots of smaller trees around it that all originated from the mother tree. This is a plant which we scientifically would call allelopathic, which at a basic level just means that it changes the chemical composition of the soil to make it harder for any other plants to grow. So when you have Chinese tallow, you often have an absence of a lot of other plants in the area that plant is growing, which is not good. That's definitely altering ecosystems. This guy can be replaced by lots of different native plants, including, once again, our red maple, our southern magnolia. Know that there are dwarf versions of the southern magnolia if you don't want to put in a giant southern magnolia, because those things can get to be humongous, but they get these beautiful white flowers on them. There's also this blue beech tree. All right, so I mentioned that Kalanchoe is my arch nemesis, and right below Kalanchoe is Brazilian pepper. Those are the two plants that I absolutely hate the most. They're awful. Brazilian pepper is on the Florida noxious weed list. We tend to see this in our coastal areas, and you guys will notice I focused a lot on the coastal areas today. That's because that's where I spend a lot of my time. That's where most of the parks that I manage are. But you still could have these further inland. We've got some areas in the St. Augustine South area that we are treating. So you definitely can see on the other side of the intercoastal, anything around saltwater. If you go down to South Florida, you'll see this plant everywhere. And my goal through education is to prevent us from looking like South Florida in terms of invasive plants, because they have stuff everywhere. And if we can start to really get the ball rolling and the momentum in the Northeast Florida area to start to tackle our invasives before we look like South Florida in terms of invasives, that's a good thing. So this plant is from Brazil. Now know if you're going to handle this plant or do any kind of removal that it is in the same family as poison ivy. So you want to make sure that you have gloves on, that you have long sleeves on, that you're taking precautions to make sure that you're not coming into contact of the sap of the leaves and of the tree. This was brought to Florida once again as an ornamental. People loved those clustered red berries, and it's kind of an evergreen. So while other plants may die off in the winter time and lose leaves, this will continue to stay green throughout the winter. A low estimate is that Brazilian pepper alone has infested over 700,000 acres of Florida's landscape. Now, once again, this is predominantly going to be in southern Florida, but we definitely have Brazilian pepper here in St. Johns County. And the longer we go without treating it, the bigger the issue it will be. This is one of those multi-stemmed trees. So just like the other one where we talked about, where it has the mother tree and a bunch of baby trees around it, same exact thing. So this one tree could have several trunks they're all connected to each other. This tree's seeds are transported by animals and by water. Now these Brazilian pepper seeds have no nutritional purpose for these animals. So it's very similar and looks very similar to when we eat corn, how that more or less stays intact and kind of goes through the system. This one will shade out other species, and predominantly where you see Brazilian pepper, you see nothing else growing, especially if it's an infestation that has lasted for a long period of time. We have been super lucky to start larger removal efforts throughout the county, and we have a couple upcoming as well later this year to make sure that we're taking care of our conservation lands on our county-owned property. And part of me giving this lecture is to try to encourage you to take care of invasives on your property so that we can work together to form this patchwork of areas that is invasive free. Now, if you're going to remove Brazilian pepper, this is one of those plants you do have to treat after you cut it down. So cutting it down is not nearly enough. In fact, once you cut it down, you have to actually treat the stump of that plant within about 10 minutes of cutting it down, because it will actually heal itself over and then regrow. So if you miss that 10-minute window, you're out of luck. You're not going to be able to treat that plant at least then. Also know that you can take a really big, really mature Brazilian pepper, and if you cut it down, it will regrow to the maturity level that it was before you cut it down. So if you took something like what's in the top picture here and you cut it down to a stump, but you didn't treat it, so it healed itself over and it started growing again, that teeny tiny plant that may now be this big can actually start to berry and be mature. So we want to make sure if we're going to remove invasives, we remove them effectively so we're not continually battling them in our landscape. You're going to remove Brazilian pepper. Once again, anything green with red berries is a great alternative. Any of our native hollies, either the Yukon holly or the East Palaca holly, are great alternatives if you're looking for actual trees. If you're looking for more shrubs, then the Simpson stopper is the way to go. So now that I've gone over some of the most common ones that you could have in your landscape here in St. Johns County, you may be thinking, oh no, I have these in my yard. Kelly, you just basically told me I have to get rid of the whole landscape plan that I have in my yard. Fear not, I have resources for you. You don't have to go out today and rip up everything in your landscape. Take it one thing at a time. It's an ever-evolving process, and here are some resources for you of how to tackle either hopefully what is just maybe one plant in your yard or your whole landscaping. So first things first, accurately identify your plants. So make sure that you're actually removing the right thing. You're going to want to research removal methods, which I will give you a resource for on the next slide. You're going to want to go ahead and remove them, and then especially if they're in a landscape setting, you're going to want to replace them with native plants, or at the very minimum, replace them with Florida-friendly plants, meaning they're not from Florida, but they act okay in our Florida ecosystems. They don't escape. But then monitor for regrowth. So just because you've done that initial removal and you followed all the steps and the guidelines does not mean that plant is gone forever. I really wish that's what it meant. It would make my job a lot easier, but it's not. So you want to continually monitor for regrowth, and you may have to do several treatments or several hand pullings of whatever plant it is you're trying to remove. So if you've identified it and you know what it is, and if you have any questions, you guys can always email me. My email is kussia@sjcfl.us. You can always send me an email, and I would be happy to help you identify anything that you need help identifying. There are also great online resources, so if you put in the plant/UF-IFAS, you'll get some good results. You'll also get this next page. So if you say you're trying to remove coral ardesia, you would put in your search bar coral ardesia UF-IFAS. And the first link that should come up is this page for the Center for Aquatic Invasive Plants. And on that page, you'll have identification at the top with lots of pictures. You'll have some background info about the plant, but then you'll also have a whole management section. In that management section, it will tell you the best ways to get rid of that plant. Whether it is mechanical, you can just dig it on out, or whether there are chemical recommendations through UF-IFAS, and it will tell you what that chemical is and at what solution rate you need to run it. So follow those guidelines. If you need any help navigating it, I am here for you. Just let me know. Now, once you've gone ahead and you've removed your plant, you've dug it out, you've properly treated it, we want to replace with natives. Go to floridayards.org and click on the Florida Friendly Plant Database. In this database, you can pick the region that we're in and what type of plant you're looking for, whether you're looking for a tree or a flower or a grass or a ground cover or a vine. Click on that, and then you'll come to a screen like this one here. And so I looked at flowers, and I, in my search, wanted native plants only. I wanted something that was going to be a perennial. I wanted something that would function really in any light range because I had multiple areas in my yard to replace with. I had a wet area in my yard, and I would have put probably sandy soil. And I was inland, so I didn't care about salt tolerance. And you just hit find plants, and it will come up with a whole list of things that meet your criteria. This is a great starting point to start to rebuild your landscaping. Even if you're not removing invasives and you want to revamp your landscaping with native plants, floridayards.org is the place to go. Now, if you're sitting here and you're like, Kelly, my yard is invasive free, I don't have anything that you mentioned, I am good to go. Well, you're not off the hook yet. I have some things that you can do to help with the invasive species problem. The first things first, don't plant them. Don't become part of the problem. So I showed you some of those ones that you could go to the store and you could buy today. Don't go to the store and buy them. They're invasive plants. You can help with local removal efforts. So in a non-pandemic situation, I host removal days. I know Anastasia State Park hosts removal days. So you can volunteer your time to help us keep our natural conservation lands invasive free. You can educate your neighbors. So if your neighbor's landscape is nothing but Mexican Petunia, maybe just have a nice conversation with them and be like, hey, have you ever thought about redoing your landscape? Did you know that Mexican Petunia is an invasive species? Now, if it's your really grouchy neighbor that yells at everybody in the neighborhood when they even step on their yard, don't go talk to that person. Go talk to the people that are really nice, that you have good relationships with, and spread the word there. Also, if you are living in a community and your community areas, your communal areas, your entranceways, your landscaping along sidewalks, anything that's handled by the community or HOA you live in, get involved in that landscaping committee. Either go and talk to them or become a member of that landscaping committee to have invasives removed and or to ensure that invasives aren't being planted in the landscape. And lastly, show removal for local efforts, or show support for local removal efforts. So a lot of times myself, the Army Corps, FWC, Water Management District, all of these local agencies consistently have removal efforts going on. And there is absolutely nothing better than getting a call or an email from someone that saw what we were doing or read an article or saw a press release that we were going to remove invasive species and just getting a kudos, like a good job, thank you for doing what you're doing. That means a lot to us that we have your support and we know we're doing the right thing. I am never going to be mad to answer a call that you are thanking me to do invasive species removal. So that means a lot. And I know it means a lot to other agencies as well, that what they're doing is supported by the public. So I like to end all of my presentations with a really terrible joke. So this is my joke for this presentation. Why do plants hate math? Because it gives them square roots. Thanks guys for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot. Once again, if you have any questions, my email is kussisia@sjcfl.us. I hope that this was really informative for you and that you're ready to go tackle any invasives that you have in your yard. Bye, guys.